we are going to have our video here on proteins. Let's take a peek at what is an example of proteins that you might have in your everyday life. So top corner here we have some nice salmon, which is fish, some nice meat, which comes from a cow, and eggs that come from chickens. So we know proteins predominantly come from animals. If you look down here, again we have milk, it's got protein in it, eggs, cheese. Again, it comes from cows, the milk and the cheese, and the eggs come from chicken, all animals. Over here we have some shrimp and some steak. Again, those are all excellent examples of proteins, again, coming from animals. Top hand corner here we have also an example where you get a small amount of protein, not nearly as much as you do in the other sources. They can come from beans, grains, and nuts. Things like soy and legumes also give you a very small amount of proteins. It's not something you would want to insist your complete diet on. You really need some of the major proteins that come from an animal. All right, so let's see what we're going to be doing today. First, you have to be able to describe the function of proteins, the elements that make it up, and the shape of proteins. You have to be able to give examples of amino acids, dipeptides, and polypeptides. You also will have to draw and describe the structure of amino acids, dipeptides, and polypeptides. Explain the relationship between amino acids, dipeptides, and polypeptides. Again, it sounds like a lot, but it's really not that much. So let's dive right into our proteins. First and foremost, we have their function. And the function, as you can see, is many. And proteins pretty much do absolutely everything for the human body except give energy. They're going to be responsible for movement, which means your muscles and your cells itself that move, structure. They are made, collagen, for example, is made up of a protein, and that is what makes up your tendons, your ligaments. It's also in your skin, your hair, and your nails, so proteins also make up those to help you give your structure or your shape. Regulation and transport, an example of transport would be hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that's in your blood that carries oxygen out through your body so you can go through cellular respiration. Nutrition, your digestive enzymes. Defense would include things like the antibodies that help fight infection in your body, your immune system that helps fight off infection or attack things that come in. And then last but not least, it's actually the most important, is enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that speed up chemical reactions and lower the amount of energy necessary for a reaction to take place. Enzymes you'll be able to recognize because they always end in ASE. So if you see a word that ends in ASE, it's a protein. Now the one tricky thing about proteins is that they're temperature and pH sensitive, and that means they work, each protein works in a specific temperature and a specific pH. If you put that protein in a different temperature and a different pH, it will not work. It may become uncoiled and unraveled, or what we call denatured. So proteins are very specific in their temperature and pH range in which they work. Let's look at these structures on the next part, in the sense that proteins are made up of molecules that consist of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And you always kind of remember that because proteins ends in N, so it contains N in its chemical formula. So if you see a gigantic molecule and you notice it has an N in it, you know automatically that that is a protein. We're going to represent proteins in a circular fashion. Technically, they generally fold on themselves and they're twisted, or they're 3D, or you might hear the word globular. MCAS loves all of these terms, and so you do need to get used to seeing them associated with proteins. If you look over here, we have a long bead. This would be a whole thing, would be a protein. Each one of these is an amino acid. They're all linked together. But if you look over here, it's a much more complex protein. You can see it has kind of depth, so that means they folded on each other, and it also is giving us that 3D shape. And we also think it's just a big, gigantic mass, so it's often referred to as globular. So those are all terms that are associated with the shape of proteins. But when we draw a protein on the board or something like that, we're generally going to represent it with a big circle. The monomers of our proteins are amino acids, and down below in this picture is the basic structure of amino acid. You have your carbon here, your nitrogen, and a carbon. This R group just means it could be almost any element, but basically you're going to have a nitrogen, carbon, carbon, and that would signify a nice amino acid, and therefore a protein. Polymers of proteins are dipeptides. We call them peptides because when you take a larger protein, like 2 amino acids, you're going to connect them, the carbon and the nitrogen, and whenever there's a carbon and a nitrogen connected, we call that a peptide bond. So far this year, you've had covalent bonds, ionic bonds, hydrogen bonds, and now peptide bonds. So anytime you see a carbon to a nitrogen, it's a peptide bond. The other polymer for proteins are polypeptides, and remember poly means many, and peptide means a peptide bond, so a carbon to a nitrogen. So it's just a whole bunch of amino acids in a long chain. And you can see by this shape here, it's a very large shape and it twists and folds on itself. So there's actually 4 different shapes that a protein can come in, but as far as you're concerned, we just really want to know them as large globular shapes. That's all there really is to proteins, not a whole lot. Make sure you go back and check out your objectives. Can you give me examples of proteins? Do you know their functions, the elements, their shape, the monomers and polymers? Do you know what a peptide bond is? So include after that, you've done your right-hand side of your notes, then your left hand with your key points and your vocab, and then don't forget a summary at the bottom. If you need help or need additional reference, check out your textbook, page 36. And then the last thing I would recommend putting in your note is the chart that's on the next page. It will help you have a shorthand knowledge of what proteins are. So if you look at it, it lists the elements, all the functions, the monomers, and polymers. All right, good luck and see you in class.